Good afternoon. I am delighted to welcome you to the annual Harris Lecture. This is our first endowed lecture for this year. It's one of our most important endowed lecture events, and we're very pleased this year to be able to welcome a terrific scholar and speaker. The Harris Lecture Series was established in 1946 and is named after Addison C. Harris, who was born in 1840 and lived until 1916. Addison Harris was a distinguished Indiana lawyer and a statesman, a member of the state Senate, and he was appointed by President McKinley as a minister to Austria and Hungary. He grew up in Indiana and was one of the state's most respected lawyers during his time. After his diplomatic post, he returned to Indiana and served as president of our law school, the president of the University of Indianapolis, the Indiana Bar Association, and Purdue University's Board of Trustees. Past Harris Lectures have included some of the most well-regarded lawyers, scholars, and legal minds of our generation. They are people who've changed the way we think and have had a tremendous impact on the law and legal institutions. Past speakers have included, among others, Judith Resnick, Mary Matsuda, Martha Minow, Reva Siegel, Elizabeth Warren, Cass Sunstein, Guido Calabresi, Robert Bork, Derek Bell, Julian Bond, and last year, Doug Kaiser. Their remarks have all been published in the Indiana Law Journal. Today, it is my honor to add to this very long list of distinguished scholars, Professor Jack Balkin, who is our 2017 Distinguished Harris Lecturer. Jack Balkin is the Knight Professor of Constitutional Law and First Amendment Law at Yale Law School. He is the co-founder and director of Yale's Information Society Project, an interdisciplinary center that studies law and new information technologies. He also directs the Abrams Institute for Freedom of Expression and the Knight Law and Media program at Yale. Professor Balkin is one of the nation's most well-known First Amendment and constitutional law scholars. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the author of over 100 articles and almost a dozen books in various fields, from constitutional law to the First Amendment to telecommunications and cyberspace, among others. He's founded and is known for his widely read blog, Balkinization. Before joining the Yale Law faculty, Professor Balkin received his PhD in philosophy from Cambridge University and his AB and JD degrees from Harvard. He clerked and practiced at Cravath in New York City before he entered Legal Academy. He has served on the faculty at the University of Texas and the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and as a visiting professor at Harvard, NYU, Tel Aviv University, and the University of London. Now, I normally end these with, please join me in warmly welcoming Jack Balkin, but I was just talking to him and we thought that was overly staid, so I'm going to change mine to the one, the only, Jack Balkin.
Hey everybody, how are you today? Are you good? How's the pizza? It's not New Haven pizza. Let me see, I'm a technology guy, so I have some technical things I have to do here. Okay, I have now done my technology thing here. Here's my second technology thing. Very good. Okay, we're going to talk about 30 minutes, then I'm going to take some questions from you, then we're going to have singing, dancing, and various other things. And then we'll have a reception where there'll be more singing and dancing. Today, the title of my talk is The Recent Unpleasantness. How many of you know what that refers to? Anybody have ever heard this expression before? This is a euphemism that was used mostly in the South to describe the American Civil War, the recent unpleasantness. And I am not suggesting that the United States is currently in the middle of a civil war or that we will soon be in a civil war. I am suggesting, however, that this sort of understated euphemism is a wonderful way of talking about the current situation we are in the United States. And I am going to use the tools of constitutional law and political science to try to explain to you what is going on. Did anybody here travel to see the eclipse on August 21st? Anyone? Yes, you did. Was it a life-altering event? No, it was not a life-altering event. It just happened. You were fascinated, right. Anyway, so we recently had a total eclipse of the sun, a very rare occurrence over most of over the United States. And you all know what causes a total eclipse of the sun, right? You know that it isn't like, magical people with wings take a big screen and put it over the sun for a while. No, what happens is that the earth revolves around the sun, the moon revolves around the earth, and the tilting of the earth's axis around the sun changes, the moon's changes, and at certain moments, what'll happen is they all line up, and what you get is this spectacular event, which is a total eclipse of the sun. So you know it's produced by a series of cycles. Cycles of the sun, the earth, the moon, and that's what produces this effect. And this is what I'm trying to tell you about today. This is what I'm going to talk to you about today. To explain what's going on today in America, we need to start thinking in terms of cycles which intersect with each other and create events. Now, in constitutional law, people tend not to think in terms of cycles. They tend to think in terms of linearity, things moving in straight lines. The two most well-known theories of constitutional interpretation are all linear. One is originalism, the other is living constitutionalism. Originalism is clearly linear. It's a story about we are moving further and further and further away from the moment which grounds the authority of the Constitution and therefore the authority of the meaning of the Constitution, and our goal is to restore ourselves to the meaning at this moment. So it's linear. It's all about you move away, and it's a story of decay, too, actually. Right, you move further and further away. The other standard theory of constitutional interpretation is called living constitutionalism, which is basically the idea in every day, in every way, I am becoming a better constitution. This is a theory which is also linear because it's an implicit story of progress. Right? The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And so the idea is time is moving, and as time moves forward, the Constitution must be understood consistent with the time as it moves forward in history. These are both linear conceptions of history, but I want to say that this is not the only way of thinking about history, and certainly if you went to the ancient Greeks or to the ancient Chinese, they would have said the way to think about history is in terms of cycles. Now, I am not into clockwork stuff. I'm not into mechanical stuff. I am more like Mark Twain, who used to say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And this is the idea that I want you to get, that there are these sort of, it's like one of those ballads that just returns to the refrain. And this is basically what we see here. The song keeps repeating. But what's interesting about what's going on right now is that we have more than one cycle at work. In fact, we have three. I'm going to talk to you about these three cycles at a moment. And when these three cycles converge in a certain way, they all line up in a certain way, you get what you might think of as a political eclipse of the sun. A very dark and disturbing time. The recent unpleasantness. So that's what this topic is about. So what are the three cycles that are at work here? I'll tell you what they are. The first is the cycle of polarization and depolarization. The second cycle is the cycle of political regimes in American history. And the third cycle is the cycle of the rise and decay of Republican government, which I would call the cycle of constitutional rot and constitutional renewal. These are all cycles, and each of them is on a different time scale, and I'm going to talk to you about them all. The first thing I want to say, there are 4 takeaways from this talk so that you understand where we're going. The first thing I want to say is we are not in a constitutional crisis. So you probably hear this on the news. No, we are not in a constitutional crisis. We are suffering from a pretty severe case of constitutional rot. And we are at peak polarization, and that polarization is connected to constitutional rot. And then the most important takeaway is that we are in transition. We are in transition. Our current problems in politics stem from the fact that we are in the final days of a crumbling, decadent political regime, and no new regime has yet appeared to take its place. This is a difficult and very sad transition, a sad time in American life, because it's enhanced by the fact that this transition between regimes is occurring simultaneously at a period of peak polarization. That's the cycle of polarization. And also at the nadir, the bottom of a cycle of constitutional rot. And for that reason, this particular transition to the new regime is going to be difficult. But we will get through it. And when we get through it, which will occur about 5 or 10 years from now, you will not remember this, or rather it will seem like a distant, unhappy nightmare from which you have recovered. It will be a different time. I have lived through, some of you are as old as me, have lived through transitions of political regimes. You may not remember them as such. And I actually refer to the transition, which was not as bad as this one, which occurs between about 1970 and 1984. I refer to it as something I call the last days of disco, which is basically what it was. And that was the transition from the end of the New Deal civil rights regime to the current regime we're living in now, which is the Reagan regime. But that was not a regime that was in the middle of constitutional rot, nor was it at peak polarization. In fact, it was the beginning of polarization. So that's really what's going on. And now I'm going to try and explain in more details. But the first thing I thought I'd do is explain this idea of regimes and cycles of regimes. Now here I'm going to draw on the work of a very famous presidential scholar, Steve Skowronek at Yale Law School. Not Yale Law School, excuse me, Yale Political Science. I'm going to talk about his view of regimes, which I think has been very influential. Here's the big idea. The big idea is if you look at American history, you'll find that there are long stretches in which one of the parties is the dominant party and sets the agenda for politics, even though it doesn't win all the elections and certainly doesn't control everything all the time. But what you get is you have party systems, and in these party systems, you have a dominant party, and it basically it calls the tune. What happens is this party creates a coalition around it, which basically keeps it in power for a while. Eventually, the coalition changes, demographic changes, social changes, economic changes, technological changes. The coalition withers and dies, and it creates an opening, not always taken, but it creates an opening for another party to basically start a new regime. And this has happened about 6 times in American history. The first regime is the regime of the Revolutionary Party, the Federalist Party, which dies very early, by 1800. The next regime is the Jeffersonian regime, which basically falls apart. For a while, we have one-party rule. It's so-called era of good feelings, but it basically falls apart by about 1824. The next regime is the Jacksonian regime, in which the Democratic Party, the party of slavery, is the dominant party. And that regime falls apart with the recent unpleasantness, that is the American Civil War. And then the new regime, which is by the ascendant Republican Party, which was created in 1854, that regime lasts for a very long time. In fact, that's the longest lived regime in American history. It lasts all the way from 1860 to 1932, when it is done in by the Great Depression. And then comes what I call the New Deal civil rights regime. This is the period of the New Deal and also the period of the civil rights era. That regime is done in basically by the 70s, stagflation, economic problems, the failures of the Democratic Party in the 1970s, producing the Reagan regime which is the regime of the conservative movement and the regime of the revived Republican Party. This is the regime we have been living on for most of my adult life. It's since 1980. This is the regime which is basically cracking up right now, right before our eyes. And it is cracking up without any new regime yet available to replace it. That is, it is dying, but the new regime is struggling to be born, and it hasn't been born yet. And why do I say that this regime is dying? Well, that might seem very strange to you if you follow American politics. I don't know how many of you know this, but the Republican Party is probably never stronger now than it has ever been. It is as strong as it was in 1928, some people say. Gee, 1928, I wonder what happened after that. The Republican Party controls the presidency. It controls both houses of Congress. It controls more of the majority of governorships. It, in fact, has one-party rule, and I think at least 25 states have, basically they own the whole kit and caboodle. At the local level, the state level is incredibly powerful and strong and robust party. But all the while, as you move upwards to the National Party is in terrible shape. You read the headlines every day, and you can see it's either in the middle of what I've called a nervous breakdown or a civil war or both. A symbolic, but certainly not the whole explanation. We could talk for a while. I could do a whole lecture just on this issue, but I'm not because I want to move on to the next thing. But just to give you an example, the party has discovered that it has multiple factions within it. Several of the factions have become quite radical. They have been unable to work with each other. They have been unable to do simple layups like repeal Obamacare, right? And as a result, the failure of the healthcare reform, which was played out over several months, is an example of a coalition that is unable to basically keep itself together and is at people at each other's throats. In this story, the president, President Trump, who will be a major figure later on in this discussion, he is really a symptom rather than the cause of this crack-up. He is, in fact, somebody who took advantage of a decaying regime and inserted himself in it in ways I'll describe later on. But the real thing to pay attention to is the regime itself, its pre-commitments, its assumptions. The regime comes into power with the idea that we're going to make government smaller. We're going to reduce regulation. We're going to reduce taxes. We're going to build up our defense. These are the main commitments, the main agenda of this regime. And as time goes on, these arguments, reduce taxes, rinse and repeat, seem incredibly unhelpful for particular problems the country faces, partly because the regime is a victim of its own success. It changes the politics of the world in turn changes, and so the advice that you give in 1980 may have been great advice in 1980, but it's no longer great advice in 2017, and this creates a series of disconnections. Part of the disconnections also have to do with the victory of the party's agenda with respect to how campaigns are run. The party was extremely what's the right word? Innovative in thinking about the running of political campaigns, but it had bad side effects in terms of the influx of money into campaigns, which then had the effect of turning the party into a series of financial warlords, that is, very large donors who turned out to call the tune and undermine the institutional party apparatus itself. So that as time went on, as these warlords proliferated and dominated politics, the donor class are sometimes called, they made it more and more difficult for the National Party basically to produce candidates who could consistently win elections. And thus, the party actually did itself in. When people talk about the crack up of the Republican Party, they talk about demographics. But I'm here to tell you that demographics isn't the whole story because, of course, if the product you're offering is something that people like, the demographics really don't make any difference. Rather, you just pick up the changing demographics with you. But in this case, what's really happening is institutional failures, the victim of its own success, factionalization, radicalization within the party have ultimately done in this particular regime, just as if you go back and look at the Democratic Party of the 1970s, without the campaign finance, but if you look at the same idea of factionalization, radicalization, inability to get things done, you'll see a very similar story. Also a very similar story, by the way, of the Jeffersonian Republicans in the period from 1820 to 1828, the so-called era of good feelings, not so good feelings at all. So that's the story of what's actually going on. We're in the middle of the crack-up of this regime without a new regime to replace it. Trump, as I said, is a sign of this regime. He's also a sign of something else, which brings me to my next topic and the next cycle I'm interested in, which is the idea of polarization. There are cycles of American polarization. Polarization peaks just around the Civil War. Polarization then stays things are pretty polarized for a long time, and then right around the beginning of the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, polarization begins to decline, and it declines significantly till the New Deal era, in which it was basically depolarized. And what you have is you have three different parties: Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, and Republicans. You have a depolarized system, and you get a very different politics. This is the politics that eventually produces Social Security, but also produces the Civil Rights Acts, which are bipartisan projects, basically, of the parties. Polarization starts to ramp up again in the 70s and 80s. It becomes a project of the Republican Party. They see it as a way to become a majority party not only at the presidential level, but also at the level of Congress and the states. Newt Gingrich is a key player in the strategies of polarization. Also, the rise of talk radio is very important in making polarization a viable political strategy. Polarization increases and increases and increases and increases. One of the things that happens is that, for example, the current rule that you need 60 votes to get anything done in the Senate is really a product of the middle of the 1990s when there's a strategy of obstruction that's used and it's tied to the idea of polarization. So in some sense, this is another idea of a party being the victim of its own success. The polarization which produces the 60-vote rule in the Senate is also what ultimately does in the repeal of Obamacare. And because they then have to turn to special gimmicks like the reconciliation measures in order to actually do it. So you see, if you basically structure a political strategy around polarization, eventually what happens is it creates problems from you at the tail end. But in any case, so we talked about regimes, we talked about polarization, but before we get to rot, I have one more thing to talk about, and that's crisis. Now, how many of you have heard somebody say on the news that we are in the middle of a constitutional crisis? Yes. The rest of you have not been paying attention. Now, generally speaking, whenever something happens that's surprising or upsetting or deeply troubling, or it looks like somebody's doing something that's really awful, people immediately scream constitutional crisis. And I am here to tell you, we are not in the middle of a constitutional crisis. Let me explain what a constitutional crisis is, and then let me explain why we're not in a constitutional crisis. A constitution is a device for making politics possible. I'll say that again. A constitution is a device for making politics possible. Politics as opposed to what else? As opposed to violence, as opposed to insurrection, as opposed to civil war. A constitution works when people's disagreements and their struggles for power are cabined in to a system of law and a system of political procedures and do not break out into violence or civil war or insurrection. So a constitution works as long as it can cabin the desire for power and the desire for dominance, which is always present in human affairs, into struggles within politics. And as long as that is happening, the Constitution is working. A constitution fails when it's unable to perform that central task. And it can happen in one of three ways. First, at some point, political officials, the president, for example, can simply announce, that's a nice constitution, I'm not following it. Things have gotten to the point where I can't possibly follow it. It would be, we have to save the country. We have to save from the enemies outside us or within us. I just have to stop following the Constitution, so I'll disobey it. That's a crisis, because their political officials are refusing to abide by that device that keeps politics inside politics and not outside it. The second kind of crisis occurs when everybody thinks they're following the Constitution and everybody goes off the cliff together, like a bunch of lemmings. Right? Well, we would never want to disobey the Constitution, and as a result, look out for that. Right. So that's the second kind of crisis, and that's a crisis of too much constitutional fidelity and not enough constitutional innovation. The third crisis is the closest to what people usually are thinking of. That's a crisis that occurs when people disagree very, very strongly about the Constitution. And they disagree so strongly that they don't simply confine themselves to op-eds and to marches and to protests. They take to the streets and they engage in violence, or they engage in secession, or they engage in civil war. That's a constitutional crisis. Now, the United States Constitution has been remarkably durable. It has only failed once. That failure occurred during the Civil War. That was a failure of the Constitution because it was unable to keep the disputes that led to the Civil War within politics, and instead it led to violence. Generally speaking, we almost never have the first kind of crisis, which is the crisis where the president announces he's not going to abide by the Constitution. There are lots of reasons for it. I don't have time to describe them, but This is very rare. The second one is also very rare, basically because Americans are very clever at interpreting their Constitution. So if they come across a problem that they think can't be solved, they just reinterpret their Constitution till they solve the problem. The third one is also very rare, and it's basically the Civil War is the central example in which this happens. So none of these things is happening. When the president issued the so-called travel ban or the Muslim ban, many people said, oh, it's a constitutional crisis. No, it wasn't. Several people said, well, he's instructed his officials not to abide by judicial orders. Well, that, if true, would be a crisis because the president is saying, I won't abide by a direct judicial order against me. But that's not what happened either. And that's not what happened in Watergate either. Nixon was ordered to give up the tapes, and guess what? He gave up the tapes. If he had said, I'm not going to give up the tapes, and I'm going to burn them here on the White House lawn, well, that would have been a constitutional crisis. So we're not in a constitutional crisis right now in the United States. I'm not saying we'll never be. I'm just saying that's not what's going on. Many people worry that that's going to happen. They're worried that one day the president is going to get on TV or tweet something on Twitter where he says, that was a nice constitution, sorry. Hasn't done anything like that. The real situation we find ourselves in is a situation of constitutional rot. You've got to roll your R when you say it, constitutional rot. What is constitutional rot? It's a decay in the features of a constitutional system that maintained it as a republic. A republic is a public thing, res publica. It's a joint enterprise by citizens to pursue the public good. That's why it's a public thing. And when a republic decays, and as I'll describe in a while, it turns into something other than a republic. In our case, it has increasingly turned into an oligarchy. The current problems that we face are sometimes spoken of as gridlock. But I want to point out to you that gridlock was often the analysis when there was divided government. We don't have divided government anymore. We have unitary government, and we still have dysfunction. So something else more deep is going on with our system, and I think it's about rot. I'll explain why right now. The United States, for the past 30 or 40 years, has increasingly become less democratic and less Republican. By less democratic, I mean that it's not responsive to popular opinion and popular will. By Republican, I mean that representatives who represent the public are increasingly less devoted to the public good rather than to a relatively small set of powerful individuals and groups. So we are both interested in the failure of democracy, responsiveness to public opinion and public will, and we are interested also in loss of republicanism, the devotion of both the public and also officials to the public good, and their diversion into serving the interests of a relatively small number of very, very powerful individuals. When this happens, what you get is oligarchy. Oligarchy is ruled by the few. When representatives are not responsive to the general public as a whole, but to a relatively small number of people, that's the name for that. There's no other name for it. That is oligarchy. Republics are especially susceptible to rot. This is something the framers understood. How many of you know the famous Ben Franklin quote, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it"? Anybody ever heard that quote? Everybody's heard that quote. But there's a story behind this quote. Everybody remembers, he thinks he's joking when he says, if you can keep it. No, he's not joking. At the end of the Philadelphia Convention, Franklin makes a speech. I'm going to read you a part of the speech. He says, "The new American government is likely to be well administered for a course of years and can only end in despotism as other forms have done before it. When the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other." This is in Madison's notes. I'm not making this up. He says this just as they're about to ship the Constitution off to the states for ratification. He says this. And when he said it, everybody in the room nodded because they knew they all believed the same thing. They understood from reading the history of mankind that republics are very difficult to keep going. They become corrupted. they are susceptible to rot. Why? Because of ambition, because of greed, because of the lust for power, because of all the failings of humanity. People in republics are initially devoted to the public good, and over time they stray from devotion to the public good for many, many reasons. For ambition, for wealth, for power, for any number of things. This had happened over and over again in human history. They believed it would happen eventually to the American Constitution. They drafted the Constitution with various devices to try to forestall the cycle of Republican rot and to have it bottom out before it turned into mob rule, oligarchy, or dictatorship. They had read Aristotle, and they knew that Aristotle believed that this is where things usually go. So if you think about, this is a way of thinking about our constitutional system and its structural features. Think about it as a kind of dampening effect, not a prevention of these features, but dampening them so they never completely fall apart. That's why you have separation of powers. So you have natural checks. That's why you have federalism, so that you always have a loyal opposition of the other party that's basically reforming itself and gaining strength. That's why you have an independent judiciary, so that the judges aren't simply under the thumb of the president or the leader. And if you look at the Constitution this way, you can see it as not just merely a blueprint for liberty, which is the way we talk about it. You can read it as an insurance policy for republics. That is, republics will get better and worse over time. They will get more public-spirited or less public-spirited. The people you elect will sometimes be very good people. Sometimes they won't be very good people. Sometimes they'll be thoroughly corrupt. There will be cycles and flow, but the idea is to create a system that can buffer itself against the worst of times. One of the prices you pay for that buffering is that sometimes it's not very efficient in the best of times. But that's Republican insurance. So, what's going on? What causes constitutional rot? Well, if you wanted to look at the sources of constitutional rot in the United States today, I can give you a whole list of them, and I will, and then I want to talk about causes. They might be the gradual breakdown of the party system. I just mentioned how the Republican Party is breaking down. Changes in how campaigns are financed. Long-term changes in the structure of mass media, which has encouraged political distrust, exacerbated polarization, and merged politics with entertainment. We now have a reality TV star as president, as an example, and made the public more susceptible to propaganda. And I use that term advisedly. For those of you who know about the history of the Soviet Union, you know that the Soviet Union, propaganda was a major tool of the Soviet state. I'm afraid to tell you, the United States is now flush with propaganda. I mean, good old-fashioned propaganda of the same form that would do the Soviets proud. We have it here in the United States now, and it is affecting our democracy. Some of this propaganda comes from outside the country, but a lot of the propaganda comes from inside the country. What causes constitutional rot? There are four central causes. I call them the four horsemen of constitutional rot. Here they are: polarization, loss of trust in government, and equally important, loss of trust in your fellow citizens. Increasing economic inequality, and policy disasters. This is a term of my friend Steve Griffin at Tulane. That's failures in decision-making by our representatives. Examples of policy disasters are the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, the 2008 global financial crisis. Probably the most important policy disaster, which has been long in coming and long in its duration, has been the way in which the government responded to the globalization. Elites have taken pretty good care of themselves in the context of globalization, but not the country as a whole. And the 2008 financial crisis is a special case of the long-term failure of the country to come to grips with this problem of globalization, its effects on a republic. Why is that? Well, let me do a little, it's time for a little political economy. So here's a big political economy idea. It's a point that was well known to the framers. In fact, it was known, the Jeffersonians were, that's what they were all about. That's why they thought that Alexander Hamilton was a monarchist. He wasn't, but that's why they thought he was. Their idea was very simple. If you're going to have a republic, that is where political representatives are representative of the public as a whole and devoted to the public good, as opposed to the interests of a relatively small number of powerful people, you have to have a counterweight to wealth and concentrations of wealth and power. How do you do it? Well, you do it by creating a broad and stable middle class. You need a broad and stable middle class because that will be powerful enough to essentially give politicians reasons to constantly make their policies adapt to the public good. If economic equality gets too pronounced, which they had seen historically in republics in the past, what happens is whoever is the wealthiest and most powerful in the country just grabs more and more political power. Then they use the political power they grab to make themselves wealthier, which in turn allows them to grab even more political power, which in turn allows them to become even wealthier, and rinse and repeat. And the result ultimately is the destruction of republics. So the idea here was that the United States would be a middle-class country. Now, they didn't use the term middle class. If you were Jeffersonian, you would have said agrarian farmer, right? But the idea is very much the same as this idea. That is, it's very important that there not be wide division in wealth, wide division in income, that there be a relatively flat relationship, and that will, in fact, prevent the cycle of increasing wealth, increasing more power, and it will also keep politicians continuously trying to please a broad base of middle-class voters. That's the ideal. So that suggests that the political structure of the United States is tied not only to its constitutional rules, right, the Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, right, the separation of powers and federalism, it's also tied to the maintenance of a particular kind of political economy. That political economy stabilizes the system and prevents it from spinning out of control. Globalization threatened this system. It threatened the system in any number of different ways. First of all, because it created enormous temptations for the accumulation of wealth and grabbing lots of economic power. And it also undermined a system of social insurance. The modern post-20th century democracies are all, let me put it this way. The best way of understanding a post-20th century democracy, it's an army with a social insurance company. The vast amount of expenditure in such a democracy is for the military, and then all sorts of social insurance schemes, which include, for example, Medicare and Social Security and flood insurance. And there are so many different forms of social insurance that affect so many different Americans, people don't even know about them. But that's mostly what a modern democracy is. These social insurance schemes basically preserve a broad middle class, and they also preserve a Republican form of government. Globalization undermines this system in a lot of different ways that I can't describe, but that's the problem, that's the threat. These four types of constitutional rot feed on each other. Let me explain why. Rising economic inequality increases polarization. It causes people to distrust each other more because the pie seems smaller for them. They're grabbing for more. They distrust their fellow citizens. It also helps produce policies that increase economic inequality. Polarization means that you spend your time worrying about, for example, culture wars and not about the fiscal policy of the United States or the particular tax policies of the United States. Over the period of the last 40 years, the United States has engaged in an enormous shift of income and risk. Income through the tax system and the fiscal system to the wealthiest Americans, but also a shift of risk. What do I mean by a shift of risk? That is, who will bear the risk if something bad happens? How many of you know about 403Bs or 401Ks or IRAs, right? These replace pensions. Pensions, in a pension, your employer takes the risk. Right? In other words, when you retire, your employer has to invest wisely, and if your employer doesn't invest wisely, the employer takes the risk and has to pay you. If you move, however, from a defined benefit program to a defined contribution program, like a 401K or a 403B or an IRA, the risk is borne by the employee. That is, the employee has to invest wisely. And if the employee doesn't invest wisely, and most people don't know how to invest wisely, then they bear the risk. This is the system that we produced in the last part of the 20th century, and there are many other forms of risk shifting as well that occurred. Most of them you don't know about. You would have to study, tax law and retirement law and the law of accidents. There's so many different forms of risk shifting, but these all occurred in the last 30 or 40 years. And that has also increased inequality, even as the tax and fiscal system has also increased inequality. All the while, polarization, you may notice, has been rising. These are linked to each other. Polarization and oligarchy cause increasing distrust in government and in one's fellow citizens. They also create overconfidence in the people who run the country, and they insulate decision makers from criticism, which then leads to policy disasters. Policy disasters, in turn, lead to distrust in government and rinse and repeat. So we have been in a sort of swirling mass of these four different horsemen of constitutional rot. They have fed on each other in all sorts of interesting and different ways, and they produce the system that we are currently in. Our system remains formally democratic, but it has become increasingly oligarchical, in fact. That has led to a series of policy disasters, including the Iraq War, the rules that led to the 2008 global financial crisis, and then the response to the 2008 global financial crisis. Politicians, unfortunately, have the wrong set of incentives. Most politicians are looking toward the next election. And therefore, if they have a choice between two strategies, one which in fact helps ensure their election, they'll choose that strategy. In the last regime, polarization has been a surefire strategy for basically securing power, and so it has been the go-to strategy over a long period of time. But here's the good news. So you're all totally bummed out by now. Oh my God, we're all going to die. Here's the good news. This is not the first time this has happened in American history. It's the first time that all the cycles have basically wound up together at the same time, but it's not the first time we've been through a cycle of rot and renewal. How many of you ever heard of the term the Gilded Age? Right. This is the period from about the 1880s through the beginning of the 20th century. The Gilded Age is a period that in many ways is very similar to ours. It is a period in which you get huge fortunes being made, huge inequalities of wealth and therefore power. It's a period in which government is effectively for sale. People joke about the senator from Standard Oil Company. There is social unrest. There is rioting. There are huge waves of immigration, changing people's ideas of what it means to be an American. It's the period of immigration that leads to the idea of the hyphenated American, the Italian American, the Irish American, and leads to a big debate over what it means to be an American. It's a period, however, that we get through and produces a series of social mobilizations, first the populism, and then later progressivism. And by about 1910, there are progressive wings in both of the major political parties. There's the Roosevelt wing of the Republican Party, and then there's the wing associated with Wilson in the Democratic Party. And over the next several years of this period, what happens is the United States slowly works its way out of constitutional rot and produces many of the reforms that are associated with the 20th century democracy. So I'm here to tell you, I not only believe that we can bottom out from constitutional rot and have a period of constitutional renewal, I've seen it done. I've seen this movie before. But there is a problem. I have to make you feel bad again. No. There's one other side effect of constitutional rot. Constitutional rot tends to produce charlatans, snake oil salesmen, and demagogues. Demagogues flatter the public. They tell them that they are misunderstood, that other people are laughing at them, that they alone understand them, and they will restore them to their lost greatness. They will make everything right again. They alone can fix it. People are not hoodwinked. This is wrong. People see demagogues coming. They see them coming from a long way off. They are not surprised. They know these people are demagogues. But they are so frustrated with the government, and they are so frustrated with their fellow citizens, that they are willing to take a chance on a demagogue and blow everything up in the hopes that things can get better. Which brings me to our president. I don't know if our president has ever read anything about the history of demagogues, but it's as if he were straight out of central casting. Demagogues are usually uncouth, ill-mannered, boorish, dishonest, corrupt, cunning, and entertaining. This particular demagogue, and I have to say it, he is a demagogue, he's like a classic version of a demagogue, engages in race baiting. He stokes fear of immigrants. He stokes fear of crime and loss of social order. He says he will eliminate corruption, but he's probably the most corrupt person who's run for president in years. He says he will stick up for ordinary people who have been humiliated and laughed at by elites. It's as if he read a book on how to be a demagogue. You know, imagine this book, Demagogues for Dummies, right? Just imagine this book. And he went through each chapter, do this, do this, do this, do this. Every single move, historically, that demagogues engage in, this guy has done. I don't know whether or not someone told him to do this, but here he is, almost on order. When you get in a period of serious constitutional rot, this is what you're likely to get. And here he is. It's like somebody called up Domino's Pizza and said, I'd like to order a demagogue, please, with extra bile. A lot of people think, well, come on, this guy can't keep it rolling for so long. Everybody's in uproar. Everybody's in upset. Everybody thinks this thing is going to fall apart any day now. No. That's not how demagogues work. Demagogues live off emotional upheaval. Demagogues live off keeping people uncertain. They keep people in perpetual crisis, anxiety. Emotional upheaval is the friend of the demagogue. Crisis is his brand. If you are perpetually upset and anxious and outraged about American politics, and you hate the other half of your country, his strategy is working. Polarization binds his followers more closely to him and paralyzes the other half of the country. That's the good news? No, that's the situation. So now you understand what's going on. But now let me tell you some more good news. Because, I have 10 minutes left, and I better end on a happy note. If you want to understand what's going on in the United States, you have to understand that this is a series of cycles which have concatenated and produced our current situation. But the thing to understand is that the president, who I've just said very mean things about, is not the cause. He is merely a symptom of much larger problems. And even today, if he were suddenly to be whisked away, if he were to resign and were replaced by his vice president, a solid Indianan, he would face many of the same problems. And the party that he has inhabited would face many of the same problems. This regime is going to go away. It will be replaced by a new regime, probably in 5 or 10 years. It's possible that in this new regime, the Democratic Party will be the dominant party. Historically, there's been alternation, but it doesn't have to be that way. The Republican Party could regroup itself, and it could start a new regime. A very different one than the Republican Party that you guys grew up in and knew. It would have a different set of key agendas. It would reshape itself. There is also historical precedent for this. Right around the 1890s, the Democratic Party looked as if it was going to make a breakthrough, and then in 1896, McKinley wins the election, and the Republican Party changes what it's about. And the regime lasts for another, really basically until 1932. And that could happen. It would require an enormous effort of will and strategic genius on the part of the Republican Party, but there are people there who are thinking about it even as we speak now and trying to figure out how to do it. But whatever happens, the politics 10 years from now is going to look very, very different than the politics you currently are upset about and are suffering through. this is the thing I want to leave you with. Constitutional development doesn't go in straight lines, it goes in cycles. And there are multiple cycles at work. There are cycles of constitutional rot and renewal. There are cycles of polarization and depolarization. You've lived mostly through a period of polarization. You don't know what a period of depolarization is like, but you soon will. And then, of course, there are cycles of regimes that rise and fall. When all of these cycles line up in a particularly unhappy way, you get darkness. But just like the darkness on August 21st, it doesn't last forever. In fact, in the whole scheme of time, it lasts only a short amount of time. You can't see that now, but I promise you, this eclipse is purely temporary. Thank you very much. I have been told by the powers that be, a man devoted to democracy and republicanism, that we have time for 2 questions. I will take 2 questions. No pressure, okay, but they better be good. Yes, sir.
So I particularly agree with your analysis about the full breakdown of society, but in my mind you left out a key player, which is the Supreme Court, especially the Rehnquist and Roberts courts.
Yes.
Which have been essential to sort of empowering the oligarchs and disempowering the individuals.
Right, so I didn't have time to talk about it. That would be another wonderful lecture. Invite me back. I'll talk about the role of the federal judiciary in how these cycles work, but you're right, the judiciary plays a really important role. Although I just do want to say one thing, the judiciary not only plays a role in these cycles, but the independent judiciary we have, whether you like the people or not, is one of the most important guarantors that will prevent the United States from sliding into autocracy. That is, if you look at Russia after 1989, the judiciary proved unable to stand up to Yeltsin, and that was a real problem. In many, many other countries, the judiciary just falls apart. In the United States, for better or worse, the judiciary is largely respected, and there are lots of institutional supports for it. This is, in fact, a good thing, even if you don't like the judges, even if you don't like their politics. The fact that they're an independent judiciary is really important. Time for one more question. Yes, sir.
So at the end of the Gilded Age, when you were seeing constitutional rise, who was the demagogue figure in the 1920s?
Oh, there were many, well, 1900s, but actually there are several, right? So you guys have been having this controversy over this Thomas Hart Benton mural? Any demagogues in that mural? Yeah, that's right. Right, so what you have is you have virulently anti-immigrant politics, and you also have the rise of the Klan, right? In the earlier part, you have all sorts of radicalism going on, both on the left and the right. And many people thought, and I'm not going to say I agree with them, but many people thought that Bryan, William Jennings Bryan, had many of the trappings of the demagogue about him. You know, the boy orator from Nebraska. Now, in fact, I'm not sure Bryan was as destructive as the current version of Shiva the Destroyer that sits in the White House, but there were many such people, and in the populist party, and the populist movement, there were many such people who start out as very public-spirited and end up as basically racist demagogues. Okay, that's it. So it was wonderful to talk to you all. Thank you so much for having me.